So my name is Peggy Fogelman, and I'm the Chairman of Education here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our panel discussion. With the planning of the new suite of galleries devoted to the art of the Islamic world, the staff in education, in collaboration with our curators, had an opportunity to conceive of programs and events that would support the aims of the installation and further the museum's mission to enhance understanding and appreciation of art and culture. When you walk through the new galleries, you'll see that they exemplify the diversity of artistic expression and the influences in the regions represented by our collection, rather than reinforce a monolithic view of Islamic art. This has allowed us to help our visitors discover the rich artistic and political interplay between the various cultures that have a history there. I use the word various because one of our core aims in our programs is to highlight the diversity of cultures and the fact that although predominantly Muslim for many centuries, these regions are home to many different traditions, beliefs, and personal narratives. Tonight's event, People of the Book, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, exemplifies this aim. It's intended as an opportunity for leading scholars to come together to discuss and debate issues that cut across religious lines, and for us to hear the many different viewpoints that exist within and among these faiths. It also helps us to connect the past with the present. The religions represented by the objects in our galleries are living faiths, and they have much to tell us about the world that we live in today. We hope that this panel will inspire you to visit or revisit our new Islamic galleries, as well as many others throughout the museum. A special thanks tonight goes to the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. They're generously supporting this event, as they have many others over the course of these first 6 months after the opening. Our moderator tonight is John L. Esposito, Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, and founding director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Before I invite John and our panelists onto the stage, I need to remind you to please turn off any beeping devices. And I also want to point out that we have microphones set up in the aisles, and we'll be using those microphones to take questions during the question and answer portion after the panel discussion. So thank you very much for attending, and I'm now going to invite our moderator and panelists onto the stage.
Thank you very much, and we're all delighted to be here. And if you haven't seen the collection yet, you really should. It is fantastic. I have a very limited attention span in museums, but this is a collection that one would want to come back and spend some time looking at. I'm sure my wife, who's here, doesn't believe me, but given my past history. But in any case, we're lucky to have 3 major scholars to address some of the themes we'll be discussing. James Allen is Professor of Eastern Art, the Khalili Research Center for the Art and Material Culture of the Middle East at the University of Oxford. Riven Firestone, to his right, is Professor of Medieval Judaism and Islam at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion and co-director of the Center for Muslim-Jewish Engagement at the University of Southern California. And Suleiman Murad is Professor of the Department of Religion at Smith College. I thought I would begin with just a short reflection on, to put in perspective where we are in terms of even considering some of these themes in an American context. I was born in cosmopolitan New York, more specifically in bucolic Brooklyn. My wife said to me, I didn't know Brooklyn was bucolic when you were growing up, but in any case, we were multi-ethnic, multi-religious, but in terms of our geography and our worldview, we actually lived in our ghettos. We had ethnic and religious neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, etc. So here we were in this cosmopolitan situation, but actually quite separated. Even if you had some neighbors who were people of another faith, for example, or met them in the workplace, often it never went beyond that. And someone would say, well, I have a good friend who's Jewish, but it didn't mean that they necessarily felt the need to learn very much about Judaism. And I can remember as a young man getting ready to join the Boy Scouts, and there was a big issue because the scoutmaster was Italian and Catholic. That was fine, but we met in the basement of a Methodist church. That was not fine. And whether or not one could actually do that. Most of us were raised within our tradition, and as I said, felt little need or weren't encouraged to look beyond it. And certainly our educational system and our media did little to connect the dots in terms of the religious landscape. America was a land of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, ethnic Catholics, and Jews. It was a land of churches and synagogues, in which mosques, Hindu and Buddhist temples were non-existent or invisible. This would be in the 40s and pretty much into the 50s. In terms of education, grammar and high schools didn't teach about religion. In fact, in the 70s, there was a big debate in the American Academy of Religion and a big project on teaching about religion in the public schools. And it was considered controversial to consider that. Colleges and universities didn't have religion departments. Religious colleges and universities did, but often they were more theology programs that reflected the tradition, the religious tradition of that school. All of this changed in the late 1960s and 1970s. There was a significant transition. As some said, we were turning east, and the east was coming here through immigration, through many religious leaders, Hindu religious leaders, Zen Buddhist masters, etc., coming to America. And that encounter of turning east was one that then began to see the growing significant representation of Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Sikhs and Jains in our society. It was really around the 60s and 70s that one began to talk about religious dialogue, but initially that was a dialogue, for example, between Catholics and Protestants. And then it became a trialogue between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And in a way, that was the way interreligious dialogue was defined for still quite a few years. That is, before we broadened it even beyond that. What that meant was that Islam, for example, was grouped with all the other religions. So, first of all, you had Christianity, often very separate. When I went to the College of the Holy Cross in 1972 to teach there was nobody teaching Judaism. We eventually established a chair there, but from 72 for quite a few years, it was Christian theology, and our liberalism meant that we hired one or two Protestants. And they did some teaching. You know, I mean, this was... And Holy Cross, one of the top 25 liberal arts schools in America. That began to change, and the landscape began to change, so that as we know today, for our younger generation, they grew up in a society wherever they are, they see or hear about Islamic centers or mosques, or you pass by a Hindu or a Buddhist temple, all of which simply wouldn't have been there those years ago. But in the America that I grew up with, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and even into the 70s, at best we talked about a Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, with Islam being put with Confucianism and Taoism and whatnot. And the only way I discovered that connection, having been trained first as a Catholic theologian and then studying Hinduism and Buddhism, was when I was literally forced to take a course in Islam and was totally resistant. And when I took it, I suddenly discovered another great monotheistic tradition with the connections to Judaism and Christianity, something that nothing in my background or education had ever prepared me for. It's only something like, I think, 20 years ago that Frank Peters did a book called Children of Abraham, or something like that. And that was the first book to come out and actually put that out there. And even then, there was a certain controversy about that, because suddenly you were connecting Islam to Judaism and Christianity, and you were talking about this family of Abraham in a more expanded sense. We now talk, and we see our theme tonight, about people of the book, and that people of the book is a more inclusive notion of people of the book. Again, in the good old days, the people of the book would have been, at best, Jews and Christians. And there are some who speak of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. although there are those who have some issues with regard to that expansion. One need only look at our TV and the recent political debates, etc., and one can imagine some of the folks who would have a problem with expanding this to Islam, and certainly in a post-9/11 world. Well, the collection here, under the rubric of People of the Book, and as you'll see, attempts to show the diversity of the Muslim experience, but also in showing that diversity, the connections geographically between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and other religions and cultures, but very much looking at the spread and engagement of People of the Book over the years. That Islam is not simply an Eastern religion, it's a Western religion in its interface with other traditions. What I propose to do today is for us to have a program that runs about an hour, followed by a Q&A. And initially, we're going to have a PowerPoint presentation that deals with People of the Book and sees it through art and the art collection. And then when we're finished, we'll engage in a conversation on a number of issues, and then we'll go to the audience. So why don't we begin with the PowerPoint? And Professor Allen will do the lead on this.
Well, I've spent a very happy few hours today going around the Met. A long time since I've managed to do that, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the wonderful new galleries. But as I went round the Met, I realized that there are lots of examples of works of art in other bits of the collection, as well as the Islamic collections, which relate to what we're talking about this evening. We're going to start with just 3 images of a Quran, in this case, a famous blue Quran, in a script which is commonly called Kufic, that you can see on the screen. And then, just by way of comparison, here's a Hebrew Bible from the late 15th century from Spain. The blue Quran is contested as to where it actually was done, but possibly in Kairouan in Tunisia. This is from Spain, and one of the interesting things from our perspective today is that the strap work is very much in the tradition of the Mediterranean in the Islamic period. Strap work is extremely common. It's a very good form of decoration if you're not going to use figural designs, and figural designs don't appear in Qurans or in this particular Bible. But it's also made up, and Reuven can tell us more about this, of tiny, tiny letters.
The design around the script in the center is the text of Scripture itself, and the design around the script is actually in micrography. So you're not actually seeing any straight lines. You're actually seeing writing that's so fine that it becomes blurred. If you look at it very carefully, you'll see, which you can't in this situation, unfortunately. You would need a magnifying glass with the piece, which, by the way, is in the collection, and it's in the early part of the collection. If you go there, it's a beautiful piece there. That is these are instructions. This is the Masorah, which is a kind of detailed description of how the grammar and syntax of the scripture is supposed to be written and why it's written particularly in the way it is. You'll see these little words on the columns to the right and to the left. This is a partial Masorah, and around the edges is a much more detailed kind of introductory information about what will be following.
Great. And then as a third example, here's a Christian Bible, a Coptic manuscript. And we see here that the cross on the left has strap work again, filling it. So what you've got here is elements which are ubiquitous in the Mediterranean. Everybody's using them. They don't see them as dividing faiths, but actually they draw on a common type of decoration. Now, we can pursue this sort of theme in various ways. Up in the new Islamic galleries is this lovely little inkwell from Nishapur, where the Met had excavations in the 1939 to 42 or something like that. And it's got a cross on it. In fact, it's got a number of crosses on, and clearly came from a Christian context. And one of the things one discovers through Islamic art, studying Islamic art, is that Christians and Muslims are working side by side with a common vocabulary, and it all depends on who the patron is as to who they do the work for and what's on the object. But in the 12th, 13th century in Syria and in northern Iraq, you find objects which are typical of the period. Some have Christian figures on, like this particular little box, which also has not only priestly figures around, but also a picture of the Virgin and Child on the base. And these images are also found on objects which are dedicated to local rulers who are Muslims. So these images across the religious boundaries of the day. It didn't matter if you were a Christian or a Muslim, they were part of a common vocabulary which evidently was appreciated by both groups. And one can see other examples of this. This is a lovely pair of minbar doors upstairs from the 14th century from Cairo. Now, unfortunately, I didn't bring with me a picture of one we have in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where I come from, which has very similar designs, not so elaborate, but in the center of the roundels is a Christian cross. Otherwise, the decoration looks entirely the same. So what you've presumably got there are workshops in Cairo which are making objects for local Muslim mosques or local Christian churches, and they simply alter the key elements to ensure that the patrons are happy with the result. Who the craftsmen were, in what faith they were, we've absolutely no way of telling because most of them are anonymous down the centuries. So there's another example of the sort of interplay of faiths. And we've already seen one Hebrew manuscript. Here's another manuscript from the West, from Spain. And you'll see that the decoration on the left there consists of half palmettes. Palmette is a palm-like vegetal growth, which, if you split it down the middle, gives you a half palmette, and that's the basis of what's called the arabesque. And the Jewish, we presume, illuminator here has used half palmettes. Sorry, I should be pointing with this thing. There is a half palmette. There's another one, and another one. And he's used what I would call an arabesque around here. That's a scrolling stem, an S-shaped stem with little leaves. So he's using a vocabulary absolutely common to Islamic, Christians, and Jewish ornamenters and decorators of the day. Again, another example of the way things cross culture, cross religions, and a couple of other examples up in the gallery. This is a wonderful plate from the Mudéjar period, the post-Reconquest from Valencia, but it's got in it oh, sorry, I pointed with the wrong thing. It's got what's called al-Afia pattern, because it's a pattern in these pieces here made up of Aleph, Lam, Ain, and that is a very common pattern in this part of the world, and it's based on Arabic. It's a repetition of that, but by this time in Valencia, we don't know whether the craftsmen were still Arabic-speaking Muslims, or whether they'd been converted to Christianity, or we don't know who they were exactly, but they're still using the traditional patterns, even though it's for Christian patrons. In other parts of the museum, I came across this Byzantine Bible, and it didn't have exactly what I hoped it had, but this was the nearest I could get, in that many Byzantine texts of this sort of date, what we had circa 1100, have what are called carpet patterns, and they're designs all over designs like the border on this particular example, which show the influence of the Islamic world, in that they follow the sort of design that might have covered a carpet of the period, only no carpets have actually survived. So the Byzantines too were interconnecting. And you can see even more of these interconnections if you go to the Limoges Gallery in the museum, which Limoges is in central southern France. And Limoges in the 12th, 13th century was a center for enamel work. And these enamels have visual contacts with the Islamic Mediterranean of their day. For example, here you have the background to these three figures is what's called a vermiculated scroll. But it's a type of scroll which fills the space but doesn't run behind the figures. And that's characteristic of other areas of the Mediterranean at this same period. So although this is Christian and done for reliquaries and things like that in Limoges at the time, that doesn't mean that the craftsmen weren't aware of other designs coming in from elsewhere in the Islamic Mediterranean, and they were happy to use them. And you can see here a wonderful example in this tabernacle of a band of decoration, which is the same pattern that we've just seen on the Hispano-Moresque, the Spanish blue and luster dish. It's Aleph Lam Ain in Arabic, and it's used as a pattern here by the Limoges craftsmen. Now, it's very interesting. Of course, it may be that these Limoges craftsmen weren't aware that they were using an Islamic pattern, but on the other hand, there's an interesting manuscript that has survived, which is written in Latin by a Limoges scribe, and in the middle of one page is a little picture of an actual Arabic inscription which has been obviously copied from a piece of silver or metalwork and just left there in the text. So it's highly likely these people knew exactly where they were getting such ideas from. And there's another one, this is rather difficult to see, but this Virgin and Child has in the folds, sorry, I'll just get back to that. In the folds there has another of these inscriptions. And costume textiles was the way that a lot of these ideas traveled. And so, just finally in this area of interest, I put in a couple of pictures from the Renaissance gallery, because there, if you look closely at Renaissance paintings, you very often find that the braid that's used for the edging of the Virgin's costume or other people's costumes do actually have pseudo-Arabic. They have derivative designs. And here you have one running here. And there's another one in this which I came across around this bit of braid. So it's quite fascinating, the interplay between the different faiths in these different periods, different areas. We tend to think in compartments, I think, in today's world. We want Muslims to be Muslims and Christians to be Christians, Jews to be Jews. But actually, in the Middle Ages, there was a huge amount of cultural interchange going on. And though you might have groups of people living together in religious groups and so on, the craftsmen were working for different clientele depending who the patrons were. Just to finish off at this section, and I must hand over to my colleagues before I monopolise the whole evening. I came across a very interesting reference in the time of the Crusades. One of the crusading counts was building a palace in Beirut. And the text which describes it says that he employed Crusader craftsmen from the West. He employed local Christian craftsmen from the local Christian communities, and he employed Muslim craftsmen from the area. So there they were all working for a patron who was a Western Christian, but it didn't matter. They got a job, and they would adapt their work to suit. I think I said enough on that topic. Shall I pass it on to?
That was very good. I just want to make a comment from today. The largest, perhaps the largest mosque in America, certainly the largest Shia mosque in the Dearborn area. The calligraphy in that mosque was done by if I remember correctly, a Lebanese Christian craftsman who volunteered to do it and did it free of charge, other than, they're bringing him over and looking after him, which I thought was rather exemplary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Suleiman.
Yeah, this reference to the Crusader Count of Beirut made me think of the Dome of the Rock. And when the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ordered its construction in the latter part of the 7th century, he could only hire for the task Christian artisans. Obviously, by that time, there were no Muslim artisans who could do such work. And in the construction, which is pretty much by the admission of all scholars of Islamic art, it's pretty much in line with Christian structures that have similar purpose, which is the Dome of the Rock. Many people think it's a mosque. Actually, it's not. It is a place of pilgrimage. It's like a martyria in the sense that people come because they have vows and they want to fulfill them. They don't come there simply to pray like they go to a mosque. And therefore, it needed a particular purpose. It needed to be constructed for a particular purpose. The Umayyads had to hire Christian artists and artisans. And even the imagery there invokes both Christian perception of heaven, and some Jewish perception also of the old temple, things associated with the old temple. Pretty much a conversation between the three traditions that it took place in the 7th century in the way the Dome of the Rock, which, by the way, is the earliest Islamic structure standing. That's as early as that. And even, obviously, if we think of the origin of Islam and the concept of the people of the book, even that will take us even further back in our conversation.
Could you address, Rivman, within the theme of people of the book, the question of Muslim Jewish engagement?
Well, this is a favorite topic of mine, and I don't want to get too deeply involved and too started on this. The interrelationship between Judaism and Islam, and really between all three of the traditions, was one of ambivalence. There was a tremendous amount of, it's a term now that's loaded, but the term that still is used is the B word, borrowing, which presumes that there's no originality if you're borrowing something from someone else. My particular position is if you're borrowing, it means that you're really you're enamored with something and you think it's wonderful, and so it's a statement of respect in going in both directions. But there was a great deal of borrowing in terms of theology, literature, style, art, form, and at the same time, each community was trying to stake out its position as being the true community and the actual true representative of the divine will. So you have these really ironic kind of relationships, and it went all directions. There was no one who was particularly more guilty or more privileged to be more polemical than the other communities. They all did it in their own stylistic way. But in the Dome of the Rock, for example, although the dome and the architecture of the dome is pretty much confirmed as a Byzantine-style octagonal structure, a monumental structure to demonstrate power and dominance, it was borrowed or brought into an Islamic milieu, and the inscriptions that encircle the inside, these beautiful, wonderful, gorgeous Arabic inscriptions that come out of the Quran, are the inscriptions that are critical of Christianity. So that in itself is a statement. So you have a kind of you have an architectural statement, you have an artistic sharing, and then you have the political statement, which in those days was articulated in kind of religious terminology. So it's a very complex relationship. Everyone is playing the same game, and they're playing knowing the same rules. The rules don't apply equally to everyone because in each community where the community is politically or militarily dominant, then the rules change over who gets to be more dominant in the polemics or in the apologetics. But in each case, everyone knows the rules and they're all playing it within the same arena.
And could you perhaps talk a little bit about the Muslim-Jewish engagement, let's say, in Andalusia or...
Well, yeah, so this is all controversial, and it's important that it is, in fact, because we really are deeply influenced by images that we have of our own history and our own tradition. And so there is a kind of polarized view of this Andalusian golden age. One position, I'm getting smiles and chuckles to my right and left for a good reason, because it has become so deeply politicized. One position is that this was the golden age for Jewish life in the Middle Ages, and it was under the auspices of Islam, and it's true that Jews were treated well, or certainly better than they were in the Christian world. Jews as a whole were treated better in the Muslim world. Jewish art developed, Jewish philosophy developed, Jewish literary theory and the science of analysis came very much out of the Muslim sciences, or the Islamic sciences that were devoted to study of the Quran, and those sciences were then brought into the Jewish community and developed in order to do the same kind of analysis of the Torah, of the Hebrew Bible, and that produced some of the greatest works in science of linguistics and grammar and interpretive sciences in the Jewish world. At the same time, the Jews were second-class citizens. This was a pre-modern period. It wasn't a time when there was supposed to be equality between the communities. The dominant political community always remained in a dominant position socially, and the dominant religious community remained in a dominant, or tried to retain a dominant community position socially as well. And that was a universal position in the pre-modern world. So when some people say, well, it was a golden age for the Jews, and this is exactly what we should be aspiring to in our own world. This is some of the positions that we see sometimes coming out of the Muslim world. The answer is that's not what we really want. On the other hand, it was the best that was available at the time, and it was better, much, much better, than in some modern periods, where, in fact, minorities were treated much, much worse than could be imagined even in the medieval period. So we're talking about the modernism of Stalinism or the modernism of Nazism. Minority communities were treated much worse than they were in the medieval world. So you can't simply say, well, we live in the modern world where everything is good, and in the medieval world things were bad, or that things were really much better in the medieval world than we can imagine. Life is complex. So I sort of danced around this topic a little bit, but it's worth thinking about.
Great, thank you. And James, could you talk a little bit about the question of figurative art, because that often comes up?
Yes, it does, yes. Have I got... Yeah, well, that's a good one to... that's a good one just to focus our minds on it, because this is a tile up in the Islamic galleries which has had the bird heads removed by an iconoclast, someone who didn't want them there and was prepared to smash them and get rid of them. So the whole question of figural art is a contentious one in the Islamic world, and when I worked in the Ashmolean, we had people who would walk in, look at the gallery and say, well, none of the pieces of objects with figural art on them could possibly have been made by Muslims. But I'm afraid that's not the case. Muslims did, throughout the centuries, make works of art with images on them. And so we somehow have to get to grips with that, recognize it, and deal with it. It's a very complex matter. I won't spend more than a moment on it, or 2 moments on it, but just to show the complexity, the Quran condemns idols, but is ambiguous in its condemnation of painting, or doesn't really deal with that, whereas the hadith, the traditions associated with the Prophet Muhammad about his life and what he had to say, do condemn images, but some of those condemnations are themselves ambiguous. For example, there is one tradition in which the Prophet's wife Aisha has a cushion with images on it, and that is allowed, But there's another tradition in which the prophet refuses to come into the room with the cushion which has images on it. So those are not clear. And indeed, there's a very interesting story in a 9th century history of Mecca about the prophet that when he went into the Kaaba, having taken over Mecca, he went into the Kaaba, the cube-shaped building in the center of the sacred shrine, and he had washed off all the images that were inside it, which presumably were mostly of idols. But when he came to an image which had the Virgin and Child on it, he put his hand over it and said, "No, don't wash this one away." And then he changed his mind, said, "No, wash that away too." So early Islam is not absolutely clear-cut on this issue, and so that accounts for ambiguity in later times. The key moment, it seems to me, is in the 690s AD, about sort of 40 years after the Prophet's death, when Abdul Malik, the ruler in Syria, decides to go for a coinage which is totally epigraphic. It has no images on it, it's just writing, and it's basically religious. And that changes, I think, the whole direction, because prior to that, he'd been experimenting with coins, some of which had a standing caliph figure on them. So he was into imagery, he was trying out to see what he could do to rival the Byzantine gold coinage and to make one that was Islamic and Arab. And so then he changed his mind and he went for the epigraphic. And from then on, the coinage, mostly, not exclusively, is epigraphic. And I think that really took the public line of Islamic art in a particular direction. But behind it, there is always imagery going on. It's not like this wonderful exhibition of Renaissance portraiture that you've got here in the Met. It's not like that where there's an approach towards portraiture, towards the human figure and so on. That is very Western, that's Renaissance, that's all to do with what's going on in this part, in Europe. But Islam nevertheless had a tradition. There are medallions known with figures of caliphs on them, there are wine bowls known with figures of kings, and so on. So it was always there in the background, and those of you who've been to Jordan will have seen the Umayyad palaces, which Qusayr Amra is covered with frescoes on the inside of human beings and animals and so on. So
James, may I ask, presumably, if this was, with this Arabic on it, that must have been created by Muslims, and then someone later, with a different viewpoint regarding the figure, decided then to remove them. So that's kind of an internal debate within the community, or this is reflective of that sort of thing, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd agree with that. And this comes from a religious building, but it must have been put into that religious building with the heads of the birds intact, and then someone else has come along and disfigured it. Yeah, fascinating.
And you do have, in many parts of the Muslim world, outside the Arab world, the use of figurative art. And even in the very controversial area today, in the portrayal of the Prophet.
Yes. Yeah, you do indeed. In fact, somewhere along this line, we've got an image of that. But you do, and that is very controversial. And as we can show, I don't know if I can quickly flick through and get those. Yes, here is the figure of the Prophet in his night journey from the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem on Burak. And there he is with no veil over his face at all. He's shown full face, whereas the more normal way of doing it was to veil the faces of holy people, the Prophet, and in this case the Prophet's son-in-law Ali and their two sons, Ali's two sons, Hassan and Hussein, from this 16th century Shahnameh.
You know, it's interesting because contemporary Jewish portrayals in the Christian world, where you have illuminated manuscripts of the Torah or of the Bible, or of Haggadahs, which are other kind of liturgical texts, you'll find humans, but rather than human faces and heads on them, you'll have birds' faces and heads on them. So there's an interesting kind of interplay.
But that's we're talking essentially about the Middle Ages. If you go a little bit earlier to the Roman period, archaeologists working in 19th century and early 20th century, especially in historical Palestine, coming across all of this very decorative, lots of use of figurative art in palaces and in houses, guessing that, oh, these cannot be Jewish, and turn out actually that in cities, Roman cities like Sepphoris, Saphoria in modern day northern Israel in the Galil, even in lots of places around Jerusalem, guessing that because of the figurative art, then this must be not Jewish, turned out to be completely false, that these are Romanized, Greco-Romanized Jews who are applying that. And what I'm using this actually to both the points about the use of figurative art in Islam and in some way in Judaism is that often we fall to the mistake of, and again that ties to the notion of people of the book, is that who represents the tradition, and often we make the mistake that it must be the scholars, and therefore we go to their books to read what their position is on a particular subject. For instance, probably I won't be exaggerating to say that 90% of what is considered to be Islamic doesn't come from the Quran whatsoever. It comes from the effort of these scholars of Islam who told us, mostly legal scholars, telling us what's right and what's wrong, whether imagery is approved or not. And in this way, we tend to completely miss the energy and the production of other scholars who are not legally oriented, or the public who are looking for different ways and different venues to celebrate the holy. And in this particular case, we see that the image is extremely used by Muslims throughout the Muslim world, probably in the pre-modern period. Probably the only major exception would be the Arab world, but even in the Arab world, Egypt would stand out as an exception. Until pretty recently, Egyptian pilgrims who go to Mecca to do the pilgrimage come back and they hire a painter to draw them doing the pilgrimage. It's a very funny way, sometimes riding a camel, sometimes actually on top of a train. But there is a figure that they want on this drawing that often they commission to be done on the external part of their house, and that is Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. So the portrayal of figurative art in Egypt, especially in rural Egypt, there has been a documentary done on that, and lately, because of the rise of some fanatical groups in Egypt, they go around and actually destroy those paintings because of their perception of the ban on figurative art. But otherwise, as this and many cases, actually, we have hundreds of these cases, demonstrate that the Muslims completely varied on this issue, and they have a tremendous conversation within Islam regarding whether the figurative art is accepted or not, let alone the representation of Prophet Muhammad. And to conclude, I know through a friend of mine, two couple from Switzerland who went around the Muslim world in the 60s, 70s collecting postcards of the Prophet Muhammad. They purchased them, postcards of the Prophet Muhammad. They purchased them in places like Turkey, in the marketplaces, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran. In 2000, the Iranian government put together an illustrated book of the Prophet Muhammad. So this notion that figurative art is banned in Islam, obviously it has its own supporters in the Middle Ages who pushed for it, and it has its own circles today, but it's not actually accurate in terms of representation of the diversity within Islam.
And even traditionalist movements would take over an area and then destroy iconographic depictions of human beings in general, and then they would lose power and another community would come in and take power and then recreate them again. So this was a movement. This is not just a modern phenomenon. Some people are crying that today the Muslim world is becoming more traditional, and it is, but we don't have the kind of perspective, the long-term perspective, to see how movements move in one direction and then they move in the other direction. And there's often point and counterpoint in such issues.
I think it's also important to point, because I've highlighted the ambiguity in the early Muslims or in the early Islamic tradition, I think it's important to point out that the Bible has the same problems attached to it, that the Christian iconoclasm movement, the destruction of images, which happened in the 8th century in Byzantium, was based on an argument that the Old Testament forbade imagery. Whereas those who supported icons also argued from the Old Testament, as indeed there were Jewish legal disputes on this very point, that while the Exodus, 10 Commandments condemn idols and imagery in that sense, the Old Testament also contains cherubim, who God said should be depicted in the tabernacle. And in the Temple of Solomon, you find bulls and lions being used as ornaments. So then you had an argument from both camps, in both the Jewish and the Christian tradition. You could have imagery or you couldn't have imagery. And so that ambiguity goes through all these holy books. And that makes life difficult. It means that scholars have a heyday arguing with each other, and the general public don't know quite what to make of it.
You know, when we talk about people of the book and use phrases, for example, like children of Abraham, and try to make those connections, one gets into the question of, for example, a Muslim perspective on other scriptures, and also the place of biblical prophets. And I'm going to ask you to address that question, but I want to preface it with an interesting conversation I had with a colleague, a Muslim leader, about a year or two ago. And it was in light of a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric that's out there, condemning the prophet as a pedophile, or, you know, all kinds of things that have been out there. And he said to me, he said, sometimes I want to say to people, you know, you really got us between a rock and a hard place, because you can do what you do, but we accept Moses and Jesus, so we can't really use the same kind of rhetoric, you know, in a kind of tit for tat, you know, going back and forth. But I'd like you to, Suleiman, to talk a bit about this question in the tradition.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be exaggerating to say that pretty much we can't understand Islam, we can't understand the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, we cannot understand the Quran without this biblical depth. And what I mean by biblical is the Judeo-Christian depth. I don't mean, and I've evolved in my own research to the point that this does not necessarily mean that it's blind borrowing. What you are dealing with is a serious conversation with these traditions, but nonetheless, it assumes the place of departure let me correct myself, it assumes that Islam starts from this conversation, takes it as its point of foundation, the confirmation of the previous prophets. The Prophet Muhammad is a prophet in a lineage of prophets. It doesn't make sense, his message or his mission and his prophecy, if he's not coming as part of this lineage. The Quran invariably makes references to biblical prophets, but unless we go to the Bible to read about them, we can't understand what the Quran really says about that. And that's a fact that Muslim scholars from very early on realized, and they went to what we call now, it's negative reference, the Israeliyat, or the material from the Israelites. But the minute they were Islamized, that is, they were documented in Muslim books, they were completely accepted, but they were given different titles. So to go back to your question, John, here, is we are looking at a movement that started in the 7th century in Mecca and Arabia. And the title of this conversation is People of the Book. Here, the people of the book means there is a book that is given. Obviously, then the question is, who is giving the book? To whom? And in this particular case, there is a Quran that is being revealed to the Arabs, and by extension to the rest of the humanity. That book that is being given assumes that God has been involved with humanity before. And it assumes that God has sent prophets before. So for God to send another prophet, and obviously here it comes to the hot issues between the traditions, is for God to send another prophet and another message, it means that something went wrong, not with the previous messages, but with the reception of the previous message. So in this particular case, Islam makes a huge deal about exonerating these prophets. So all of a sudden, figures like Abraham, like David, like Solomon, becomes completely more exonerated as never having sinned than you would find if you would look, for example, at the Bible. And that is a fixation, so to speak. Obviously, Islam is extremely concerned with the notion of monotheism, to the extent that you cannot exaggerate by saying Islam, or at least the Quran, is obsessed with monotheism. It doesn't tolerate anything that compromises it. Hence, the problem was the way Christians celebrate the divinity of Jesus. But aside from celebrating the divinity of Jesus, there is no problem there. And that's not because of tolerance. It's part of the dough that makes up Islam. Without that component, the Jewish and the Christian, you cannot have the whole dough. You cannot have all of Islam. And really, it becomes extremely worrying to see the discourse that as Muslims, we don't need the other traditions. Obviously, every religion established some kind of self-reliance in terms of scholarship and theology. But, for instance, Christianity achieved that by incorporating the Old Testament, hence the notion of the Old Testament. But the Old Testament is incorporated in the sense that it prophesies the coming of Jesus, and therefore it is integral to Christianity. And in early Islam, actually all the way till probably later Middle Ages, all Muslim scholars were operating from a kind of similar approach. Without all of that history, we can't make sense of what's coming. To this day, like 2 days ago, I was looking online and I found this reference to a manuscript discovered in Turkey 20 years ago of a Bible that prophesies the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, where actually Jesus said, wait for the coming of the Arab prophet whose name is Muhammad. Whether that is bogus or not is beside the conversation here, but here it tells you that this is an anxiety in Islamic scholarship from very early on, that the Bible has to prophesy the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. And you ask, why? Because if the Bible does not prophesy the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, there is something genuinely wrong here. But the Prophet Muhammad derives his legitimacy from the traditions that came before him. And there is an image, we can jump to it in this kind of, it's very appropriate for this point.
Sorry, that's... which one was it?
It's about the birth of the Prophet Muhammad.
Oh, yes, sorry, it's gone. I think we've passed it. It's there.
Oh, yeah, that's... this is a very fascinating image of the Prophet Muhammad, the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. You see his mother laying down, and he is being... this is the Prophet as a baby, and there are these two angelic figures, or, as I say to my students, visitors from heaven. At the time, if you want to visit from heaven, you need to have wings, or you need to have someone to put wings on you. But actually, they are not angels. This is Mary, and this is Asiya. And the idea here, this is a book that was illustrated, History of the World, illustrated in order to confirm the Mongols who were in Iran in their conversion to Islam. So the person who did it, who was Farid ad-Din, was probably thinking that this is his most important achievement as a human being, is to convert the Mongols who were already conquered most of the Muslim world and are settling now in Iran, out of which came the Ilkhanid dynasty. And the point for why, whether he intentionally put it or whether the story emerged as a result of this painting, again, becomes a little bit beside the point here. But the story is that the Prophet Muhammad is being born with the testimony of the mother that gave birth to the previous prophet, Jesus, and the woman Asiya is the wife of the Pharaoh who supposedly picked up Moses from the stream, as Louis Armstrong would say. And subsequently, this is not simply two women from heaven who gave birth to the previous prophets coming to testify to the birth of the new prophet. This is also symbolically Judaism and Christianity coming to testify and attest to the birth of Islam. So it's extremely powerful, this kind of representation. They were not simply representations. They carried with them tremendous kind of symbolism and dogma about the relationship between the three traditions in a way that is somehow lost to us in our modern conversation. And sometimes, however we try to emphasize it, we don't seem to make the point.
I would like to just add an observation that we were sort of playing with a little earlier, and that the question is, these are not the three magi, but the image and the notion of people coming and observing and witnessing such a great birth, and perhaps coming from afar, although it's not clear from here, is something that is a clear correlation, and it looks like it might, in fact, just from an artistic point of view, might be possible. I actually would like to take this image because it's indicative of a great deal of anxiety to Christians or Jews, because an image like this, this is one medium of conveying a kind of theological or religious perspective which shows anxiety in all directions. On the one hand, Islam makes no sense, as Suleiman noted just a moment ago, without some kind of preceding tradition that affirms the truth of this tradition. And so there's a certain dependency. It's an emotional and a psychological dependency, and that produces a certain amount of anxiety in Muslims who would look at Christians and Jews who came before, and at the same time, the Jews and Christians are tremendously anxious about, I didn't know that was my tradition. My tradition is just confirming the truth of the greatest prophet, well, what about my own tradition? What does that mean? Was the purpose of my tradition simply to prophesy the coming of Jesus as the Redeemer of all humanity as a Jew? Or was my tradition of Christianity only to demonstrate or to bring the final prophet who in fact confirms all the errors that we had made in our own tradition? So there is a great deal of anxiety and tension, I think, that is found moving in all directions between the three traditions, and it doesn't always take a lot to trigger it and to bring it out into the open.
Well, just one final observation, then we go to the audience. One of the things that I've always perversely enjoyed coming out of the Christian tradition is, on the one hand, the way in which we talk about the New Testament and then we talk about the Old Testament. I mean, so you're framing a whole story there, and the supersessionist approach that Christianity supersedes Judaism, and Judaism therefore is incomplete without the coming of Jesus, who is the Messiah, and etc., and the Son of God, etc. And then the problem that many Christians would then have when another tradition comes along and in effect says pretty much the same thing and just extends it, and somehow that becomes a kind of offensive impossibility, and you see that dynamic playing out not only in past history but as you're referring certainly today, and even more so on what I would see as on the fringe rather than even within the mainstream. That the fringe sort of groups and theological positions are as at times as intolerant as anything that one might have thought of in the past, and yet we see ourselves as living in a modern period, and many of those who engage in that kind of rhetoric have very modern educations, living in pluralistic societies. With that editorializing, we'll now go to the audience, if you have a question, we have microphones. If you come up to the microphone and identify yourself, ask a question. Please do not give a speech. In the words of Leslie Gore, it's our party. Go ahead.
First, let me really express at least my appreciation of this kind of a presentation, which is really needed in these days. And let me pick up the last comment that was made about the anxiety, as was expressed by the gentleman second from the left, my left, and tie it to the initial comments that you yourself have made when you were brought up in Brooklyn, where you had different ethnic groups or different religious groups, and yet you were sort of segregated. In other words, even though you were living in the United States of America, but still there was not that personal relationship between these groups. I would like to refer to my childhood, which was in Turkey. In my neighborhood, we had a synagogue, a church, and a mosque in the same area. And not only did we have these different religious institutions, but the people who went there and prayed, they also knew each other personally. In other words, they were not confined to their homes. So, I mean, if you look at the Ottoman history, you will see, by the way, Ottoman Empire happened to be one of the longest living empires, and one of the reasons for that was because of the tolerance, religious tolerance, and all that. But I'd like to tie that back to our present day, where we are living in a digital world. In other words, as one of you made a comment, that we somehow would like to put things in their pigeonhole, and they stay there. But the previous world, as against the modern world, was more analog rather than digital. So I'm thinking that the conversations that we are carrying here and the kind of presentations we are having, hopefully, will bring us back to the analog world through the digital world, because if you look at an analog picture, actually when you look at it under a microscope, they are digital, but they are connected with each other. So having said that, let me get to the subject matter of the particular presentation here, which was the people of the book. Now we are talking about, okay, my question is, really, isn't it that we should have the book of the people? In other words, as I believe Suleiman Bey had indicated, that we have looked at the various ethnic questions and so on through the works of some authors or writers whose ideas were presented to us, but we did not have a chance to hear the people. When you go and look at the people selling cards of Muhammad, for example, which the writers of the books, they said that, you know, that was against Muslim religion, and the people themselves were showing the images of Muhammad, which says that, therefore, my question is, let me get to the question, rather than people of the book.
You've talked longer than I have all night. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I said I should sit down, perhaps. But don't we really need the book of the people? And I think that internet is going to bring that. In other words, the interaction of the people, bringing together what the people really feel about these religions, where in Middle East you have an analog picture where you do not differentiate, but you integrate. And I think that's what...
Suleiman.
Yes. Thank you.
In 25 words or less. No, take as much time as you need. Take as much time as you need.
I'm not sure if we can achieve that. Honestly, my point, and I think probably we might all agree about it, is we have to respect differences. And sometimes those are heated differences. What we should not respect is those differences justifying violence. Because in the final analysis, even I, as a person, as a scholar, as a thinker, I differ with someone else who might be examining the same stuff I'm working on and coming up with different conclusion. We might fight it by words and conferences, but in the final analysis, when it's all over, we go and have coffee together and say, so it's fine to be people of the book, and probably I would say people of the books. to emphasize the complexity is that even that book that we invoke is much more complex than we think or we give it the credit. And there are so many other books that appear all of a sudden, oral or otherwise. What about the oral Torah, okay, or the interpretation of the Quran that is extremely powerful in our understanding of the written text? So let's keep the people of the book. It's not fine. It's not going to be problematic, except as you said, in the final analysis, we should find a way where, despite our serious differences, and those reflect tremendous level of spirituality and devotion to each respective tradition, we need to respect the right of the other to differ. We don't need to like that point of view. And in this way, that notion of people of the book can stay. In the Middle Ages, for the most part, it was like that. When Jews lived in the Muslim world and Christians flourished, the Christians were the majority in the Muslim world till the 9th century, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria. So the Muslims didn't really get scared, like what we should go around and kill them. And there were no serious attempts made in that direction. There were a few episodes of serious intolerance, but for the most part, this attitude is that, yeah, they have their religion, we have our religion. And that what was partly, I think, in your story about your background is the fact that you could see that kind of tolerance. I'm not nostalgic of the past, and I think sometimes, as you said, we blow it out of proportion, especially in the case of Spain and convivencia. But there is something to be said about the pre-modern period that sometimes we overemphasize it, sometimes we confuse it. But it's that thing that we have to, in the modern age, we have to respect the difference and not trying to impose that everybody has to essentially believe in the same thing.
But one of the things that you do see today is that there are those, whether they consider themselves to be simply speaking about this from a scholar's point of view, or they're people who see themselves as, I don't know what, progressive Christians or progressive Muslims or progressive Jews, who would say that they believe that if you really want to understand the faith and what the faith is about, one doesn't necessarily have to just stick to the traditional way and the traditional texts, that are seen as the sine qua non authoritative text, but that rather, the question is, down through history, believers have interpreted their faith. And sometimes the religious scholars didn't go as far, and that in today's world, the conversation continues, rather than you have this absolute, reference point. And I certainly see that when I deal with Muslims who are grappling and see themselves as wanting to take a more progressive position and to talk about Islam, let's say in America today. And I think that's true for many Christians who don't simply want to be dragged back. Those who follow, for example, the dynamic within Roman Catholicism, of moving to a Vatican II and then pulling back, but seeing the players who are more traditional always using certain people, certain texts of the past, ruling out others, and often not looking at what most people believed and did and said. Even today when people want to debate, about the question of jihad, most people rule out actually looking at what do most Muslims today believe about jihad. And I think that can make a difference. Yes, next. Oh, sorry. I couldn't. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Esposito, for putting together such a nice lecture. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the point that you had just brought up. What really defines modern religious culture? Is it the books and the scholarly institutions, or is it the people and the general traditions that come out of it? Because, for example, the man on the left talked about how the Bible is instrumental in demonstrating the prophet's purpose and his lineage and his connection to the past and the connection to the future. But for example, in Morocco, it's almost impossible to find a Bible to read, and people strongly condemn the notion of buying a Bible because it will corrupt your understanding of the Quran. So how do we balance the society and the scholars and who really has, quote, the right of way, end quote?
I can show you a Bible you can buy in Morocco. It's called The History of Tabari. That's probably the most important book of history written by the 10th century Muslim historian from Baghdad. And if you look at the first two volumes, it's all biblical history taken verbatim from the Bible. So yes, you can buy a Bible in some Muslim countries, but you can buy the Bible recycled. And this is not a case. I have a colleague of mine who recently published a book on a Muslim scholar of the Quran in 13th century Cairo, who wrote, obviously in defense of Islam, but in complete kind of conversation and engagement with the Bible. He read the Bible and he made some kind of commentary on the Bible, precisely for the Muslim audience. I agree completely with you, John, on that point. And your question reflects something serious, is if we want to know Islam, we want to push the issue by saying, okay, what are the things that everybody has to know about Islam in order to distinguish it, it seems, from others. But then this betrays the complexity of the Islamic tradition. You know, there are things that for example, most Sunni might agree on. But if you put a Sunni and a Shia to talk about pretty much most of the issues in Islam, they don't agree. Really, if you put all Muslims in one room and tell me one thing you all agree on, there's not a single thing that comes out. I'm not exaggerating. There are Muslims who doubted the oneness of God by thinking that God can reincarnate in other figures, out of which came several sects in medieval Islam. There are sects that felt that the angel who came to give the message to the Prophet Muhammad got lost and gave it to the wrong person. He was supposed to give it to another one. He gave it to Muhammad. And you go on from there about how to put your hand when you pray. Do you put them around your waist or down beside your sides? On everything, the Muslims differ. And therefore, it is this conversation that happens with Islam that often get butchered when we want to generalize about all of Islam. I'm fine generalizing, but we have to accept the fact that there is nowadays, if you go to Turkey, you don't find any postcard about the Prophet Muhammad. 20 years ago, you used to find it. In Pakistan, you could find it 20 years ago. You can't find it today. If you put a postcard of Prophet Muhammad, they'll blow up your shop. So the point is, there is a voice of Islam that seems to be bullying and forcing others to go silent. Not that the others are not anymore existent. They are there, except that the others are going silent.
Yes.
My name is Habib Ahmed. Thank you very much, Dr. Esposito, for a wonderful, wonderful evening here. We talked about the commonalities, and we all know if you do a little bit of research, there are a lot of commonalities among three faiths. But there are some major differences also, whether it is the belief whether Jesus was crucified, or he was raised before the crucifixion, or whether it was Ishmael or Isaac who was being sacrificed by Abraham. Islam believes differently than the other two faiths in these instances. But nevertheless, the commonalities are so much, I don't understand why we always fight and bicker and why all these problems. My question to any one of you is, do you think of any good reason that this Islamophobia industry is flourishing? Since 9/11, there are about 6 to 7 foundations who have spent more than $50 million to make sure that the Muslims and Islams are portrayed negatively. Whether it is Pamela Geller or Daniel Pipes or Representative Peter King or Naina Darwish, etc., people go on and on. Why are these people trying to put these three groups, these three children of Abraham, 2 versus 1? Is there any particular reason why people do that? And any of you can give an answer.
I'm going to jump in on this because I've done a book on Islamophobia, and also Just briefly, if you look at Huffington Post or the Washington Post on faith, I've done a number of pieces on this. Or if you get on a plane tomorrow, you can fly to Chicago. I'm speaking on it in Chicago at a fundraiser. But, you know, what he's referring to here, among other things, is a study by the Center for American Progress that just looked at 7 American foundations. So not all the foundations, et cetera, but looked at 7 American foundations and their donations over a 10-year period and found that among the many things these foundations supported, some $42.5 million, for example, went to organizations and websites that engage in Islamophobic rhetoric and actions, et cetera. I think the reasons for it are quite complex. If you're looking at America or Europe, to put it in a broader context, you do have a kind of anti-immigrant wave that has emerged and is sweeping across many societies. We see it in our own society with the debate over, immigrants, et cetera, and immigration laws and immigration regulations. I think that with regard to the question of Islamophobia, it is very much geared, and it's not something that's simply a 9/11 phenomenon. The second edition of a book I wrote called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, which actually came out in the late 1990s. In there, I document newspaper articles, syndicated columnists who engage in this kind of rhetoric. I mean, who in effect say there's a demographic threat, Muslims are going to sweep and take over Europe and America, or there's 14 centuries of jihad, and of course the reverse. You have people who say there are 14 centuries of crusades. But I think that certainly was heightened incredibly by the post-9/11 period. And you could see it very clearly in the debate over the, not just the debate over the so-called mosque at Ground Zero, but how that unleashed a kind of tsunami of anti-mosque activity. And I think if one looks at it closely, a lot of it does come from the impact of 9/11, but particularly the exploitation by demagogues who deliberately engage in a language that will provoke fear and often make charges that, for example, don't exist. For example, the whole anti-Sharia. When no one is asking for Sharia in states, you have states, Oklahoma, 76% of the population vote. I had a woman write to me from either North or South Dakota. Being from New York, I can't tell the difference between the two. But in any case, she wrote to me and said, there's a member of our legislature introducing an anti-Sharia bill, and she said something like, there are only about 2,000 Muslims in all of South or North Dakota. She said, and so I don't understand, why that is occurring. And the fact that the rhetoric is so high can be seen, or its impact. Look at the last presidential elections. Okay, look at most of the Republican candidates. Look at the stuff that was put out there with regard to Obama in order to discredit him. Look at the last congressional elections, and look at a fair number of the Republican candidates, particularly people like Rick Santorum and others who engage in that. And I think a lot of it is built into a bias, into a fear. Some of it is driven by religious considerations. There are elements of the very far right. John Hagee, the Reverend John Hagee, Parsley, Franklin Graham, and many others who have their own agenda on this. And so you do get, a certain kind of, certainly during the Bush administration, neocon, and then hard right evangelical. I don't mean all evangelicals at all, because I work with a lot of evangelical ministers, but hard right evangelicals who, for religious reasons, but also have political implications, take a very strong anti-Muslim position.
I would like to respond to the question as well, from a study of religion perspective. Whenever a new religion emerges into history, its very existence is a threat to the establishment religions and the established religions that exist already. Whenever a new religion comes into the world, the founders and the followers are essentially saying the old religions are meaningless and I'm looking for something better. And the representatives of established religions don't like that. usually new religions fail of their own accord. There are many new prophets that arise in every generation, and they usually collapse. But when a new religion becomes successful, and it becomes extremely challenging to the established religion inevitably reacts by trying to destroy the new religion, often just through rhetoric, but sometimes it can be physical. And so there is a tension, and the tension becomes established, really, within the religious rhetoric of both traditions at this point. So the establishment religion is trying to prove to the world that the new religion is not a true religion. The prophet is not a true prophet. The scripture is not a true revelation. And the new religion is trying to demonstrate that it, in fact, is better. Otherwise, why would I be there? I have a product on the religious market, and I want to get new adherents or new customers for this product, and I have to demonstrate that my product is going to give you more satisfaction than the product that's already out there. It's a very simple process, and it's something that when you look at it in these kinds of capitalist terms, that you begin to understand the kind of tension that it creates and the anxiety, this term that I used earlier. And so what happens is both religious institutions develop within their religious culture a kind of prejudice against the other through writings, through theology, through sermons, through music, through folklore. And that becomes embedded in the cultural realia of the community of people who are belongers or believers in that religious tradition. So to just give you move away out of the theoretical and into the actual historical, when Islam emerged into history, it was an extreme threat to the established Christianity, which was the dominant religion at the time. It was a threat also to Judaism, but Judaism wasn't as successful historically and politically and in terms of numbers as Christianity. And so as a reaction to the success, the astounding success of Islam in that early period, there developed a whole series of writings. You can find them. Many of them have been translated now into English and are available, that discredit the Prophet, discredit the revelation of Islam. And those kinds of images and notions have become deeply embedded in Western culture in general. So when something like 9/11 happens, and suddenly you get this tremendous response or growth, you have the creation of a new word, Islamophobia, that didn't really exist before that time. I think it was coined in the 1980s. The response is an activation of a kind of latency, a kind of latent anxiety or prejudice against Muslims that is embedded in Christian or Western society since long before the Crusades. But the Crusades was a period in which there was a tremendous growth in the anti-Islam industry, if you will, that was part of Western culture. You have that kind of situation that is, now I just took the example of Christianity and I don't want to go off too long on this, but you have a kind of embedded prejudice in Judaism against non-Jews, which is a kind of reaction formation to the tremendous success of Christianity and Islam. And so Jews, in the Jewish culture and the very kind of Jewish milk that one is nurtured by, whether you are religious or non-religious, you pick up these kind of attitudes and this perspective. And I don't want to leave Islam out. So Islam also has a lot of resentment against Judaism and Christianity because Jews and Christians for all of history, all of Islamic history, have always said, well, Islam is not a true religion and Muhammad is not a true prophet. Muslims say, you know, we accept all your prophets. Can't you just accept one more? You know? Right. So this kind of situation is one in which it's not surprising that Islamophobia, or at least anxiety toward Islam, is so deeply embedded. What we need to do if we want to, resolve these kinds of issues is, one, we have to recognize that they exist and they're simply a part of culture. You can't erase it from culture. But what you want to do is think about how can that latency remain latent and not activated, and how to deactivate when you get prejudice like this, which has become a kind of part of the public discourse.
Can I add one
Yeah, and then we
comment?
have to end because it's 7:30 and we have to clear out of the room, unfortunately.
Exactly what you are saying made me think of the court in the Abbasid Empire, often, especially in the early period, when the caliph would summon to the court representatives of different religious groups, including Jewish rabbis, the patriarch of the Christian patriarch of Baghdad, and some Muslim theologians to debate a topic. He would challenge them, who will defeat the others? And then that generated tremendous industry of refutations, writing to refute the other in order to make the case in the court. It was all supposed to be scholarly. The problem is the context that produced this is gone, and we are left with these books. We don't know why they were produced. They obviously bring tremendous negative connotation, and we use them to fuel conflicts. The problem, again, is when there is tension between the communities, these books become almost like bread for the fire. And when there is instance that you want to create tolerance between these communities, all of a sudden these books are put on the shelf and forgotten about. So again, it becomes extremely complicated, that kind of particular industry.
Well, unfortunately, as I said, we have to literally end at 7:30. I've been told that multiple times, but we will be around here. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for a very engaging program, and I'd like to thank the audience for some terrific questions. Thank you.